a comment about.
Thank you. I'll begin by following an idea that Nikhil Singh had at the previous stop on the Marxathon, which is to work at the intersection of the archives of Marxist thought and the archives of black radicalism. I'll just read an excerpt from a poem by Amiri Baraka called The Dictatorship of the Proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat. You need to say that, need to hear that, not be scared of that, because that's going to save your life, going to make your life change from suffering. You hear that, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and be scared. Think somebody going to hold you back, hold you down, downer than you've been held, which ain't even in it, is it? Not downer than we've been held, because we've been held down, like down and dirty we've been held, way down. It shows you how powerful, how strong and cruel powerful these capitalists are, these super billionaire bloodsuckers, because they put words in schools, radios, newspapers, televisions. Words coming out of the heroic hero's mouth heroically. The happy cop, the strong sensitive cop, the tall cop, the cop with the hip mustache, the laughing cop, the hippie cop, Batman and Robin cops, Negro cops, Puerto Rican patrolmen. Are these the same gentle goody heroes who killed the little 14-year-old in Bed-Stuy, the 12-year-old in Queens, the 18-year-old in Staten Island, the 16-year-old in Long Branch? Yet when you hear about the dictatorship of the proletariat, you don't know. You ain't sure. You heard about Hitler and Franco. The Daily Star, Ledger, News, Courier, Time, Bulletin tells you dictatorship is bad, all but the dictatorship being run now, the dictatorship of the minority, which is currently being run, at this moment crushing your whole self down, the present legitimate bloodbath incarceration of labor, truth, and beauty. The dictatorship of money is good. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, this is good. The dictatorship of poverty and terror, this is good. That's the lies the ruler's mouthpieces spout. The cackle, slobber, screech of madness in power. They preach that the absolute control of our lives by the owners of the factories, the absolute control of our lives by the owners of money, the absolute control over our lives by the owners of the land, that bloody clique of fiends, their parrot mouthpieces claim is just. I don't have much to add to that. But I can try to trace out some of the implications of this lucid presentation of one aspect of the importance of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Marxist thought. And I had originally proposed doing this stop of the Marxathon on Lenin's State and Revolution. Philip proposed being more broad and talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which takes us back to Marx and Engels. But just a note about Lenin's State and Revolution, he started as early as 1916 making notes on a manuscript called Marx and the State, and then began to write the State and Revolution in August 1917. There's a postscript to the State and Revolution which says, in the drafting of this book, I was interrupted by events. That event was the October Revolution. So one should welcome that kind of interruption. And so I want to also invite you to interrupt me as I speak. If I'm not clear, if there are questions that you have, to go ahead and intervene. Because the dictatorship of the proletariat is an extremely rigorous and complicated concept, and explaining it requires a pretty detailed philological exposition. And at some point, I will simply have to stop doing it, because otherwise we would be here for too long, and Philip also has comments. So, first of all, we have to distinguish the question of dictatorship from the use of revolutionary terror, or less dramatically, coercive power and the suspension of civil liberties in a post-revolutionary situation. Now, in certain situations and in certain elaborations of the concept, they are presented as identical or they are conflated, because the dictatorship of the proletariat is always met with counter-revolutionary violence. And the stakes of defense against that kind of violence are very high. And the primordial example of this is the Paris Commune, whose defeat resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. The numbers are disputed, but it's at least 10,000. And Lenin is said to have counted each day that the Bolshevik Revolution outlived the lifespan of the Paris Commune. Commune plus 1, Commune plus 2, etc. However, the specific tactical considerations of responding to counter-revolution, I argue, are not intrinsic to the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat and that we can distinguish them analytically, but that's what Philip's going to talk about. I'm going to talk about other aspects. I'll add that in the case of Russia, which is the case that makes many people skeptical of the idea, the dynamics of terror and coercion led to the ultimate failure of the revolution, but this is not because of the defects of the dictatorship of the proletariat itself as a concept or practice. Rather, they were due to the failure to adequately achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat. As Etienne Balibar put it in 1976, what started as the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia coexisted with survivals of the capitalist state and ultimately generated the dictatorship of the bourgeois state apparatus over the proletariat. And this is why Rosa Luxemburg argued in 1918 that the post-revolutionary regime in Russia was a distorted expression of the dictatorship of the proletariat, implying that the dictatorship of the proletariat should not, in itself, involve the kind of use of coercive state power that had already begun in Russia in 1918. She said, "It would be demanding something superhuman from Lenin and his comrades if we should expect of them that under such circumstances," and the circumstances she's talking about are the failure of the German Revolution and the occupation of Russia by the imperial powers, that under such circumstances they should conjure forth the finest democracy, the most exemplary dictatorship of the proletariat, and a flourishing socialist economy. So she's saying that it's precisely the inability to fully achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia that led to its authoritarian degeneration. Now, for this reason, I also want to maintain that Lenin's analysis in The State and Revolution, which begins before the October Revolution even happens, retains its validity, despite the various failures and disappointments of the years that follow. But rather than leaping to the contentious figure of Lenin, we can begin with Marx and Engels. So, the basis of this language in Marx and Engels. On January 1st, 1852, Joseph Arnold Wedemeyer, who was a member of the Communist League who lived in New York and would later fight for the Union in the American Civil War, published an article called Dictatorship of the Proletariat. And a couple months later, Marx wrote a letter to Wedemeyer in which he said the following: "No credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic economy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, 1, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society." So this is the first foundation I would like to present to you of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Marxist classics. And I would like to elaborate on its meaning, which is suggested by the third item in Marx's list, with a passage by Engels in 1884 from his Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And it is perhaps one of the most beautiful passages he ever wrote. He says, "The state, therefore, has not existed from all eternity. There have been societies which have managed without it, which had no notion of the state or state power. At a definite stage of economic development, which necessarily involved the cleavage of society into classes, the state became a necessity because of this cleavage. We are now rapidly approaching a state in the development of production at which the existence of these classes has not only ceased to be a necessity, but becomes a positive hindrance to production. They will fall as inevitably as they once arose. The state inevitably falls with them. The society which organizes production anew on the basis of free and equal association of the producers will put the whole state machinery where it will then belong, into the museum of antiquities next to the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. So before continuing, let's look at how the state is defined in the classics. Engels, in the same work, describes the origin of the state in ancient Greek, Roman, and German societies as the byproduct of the emergence of class divisions. He says that the state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is split into irreconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms and classes with conflicting economic interests might not consume themselves in society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate this conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. And Engels specifies that this separate public power is necessarily a violent and coercive one. The state, he says, consists not merely of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons and institutions of coercion of all kinds. Now, across history, the dominating class changes, and this separate and coercive power takes many forms. According to the analysis of the classics, parliamentary democracy is the state form which arises with the capitalist mode of production, and despite its various declarations of rights, is still an armed power with the apparatuses of coercion. This is because it does not spring out of nowhere as some kind of new manifestation of an ethical idea. As Marx writes in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, it inherits the apparatuses of the previous form of state. He says, the executive power with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its wide-ranging and ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000 beside an army of another 500,000, this terrifying parasitic body which enmeshes the body of French society and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the time of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of the feudal system which it had helped to hasten. The parliamentary republic, in its struggle against proletarian revolution from below, found itself compelled to strengthen the means and the centralization of governmental power with repressive measures. All revolutions, meaning the previous bourgeois revolutions, perfected this machine instead of breaking it. The parties which alternately contended for domination regarded the possession of this huge state structure as the chief spoils of the victor. All right, so the fundamental principles of the classics, as elaborated in these quotes. 1. The state has not existed for all of history, but is specifically the result of class domination. 2. The socialist transition is directed towards the abolition of classes and therefore the state. It is crucial to remember that these two principles are absolutely clear, explicit, and irrefutable foundations of the thought of Marx and Engels. And they must be maintained against what can only be described as a slander of Marx and Engels by self-proclaimed Marxists who today claim that the capitalist state can be used to legislate socialism into existence, and that socialist society involves the permanent existence of a socialist state. Marx and Engels, then, have more in common with an anarchist today than a self-proclaimed Marxist who would dishonestly claim that Marxism justifies the forms of the bourgeois state and advocates their perpetual existence. Okay, now, the meaning of dictatorship. Why, if the ultimate goal is the abolition of the state, does Marx use the term dictatorship? In the 19th century, this word had no clear and determinate meaning, and it was certainly not seen as the opposite of democracy. Democracy, which I might get to as its own concept later on, did not yet have a universally recognized validity as the best form of government. What we describe today as dictatorship would in Marx's era be commonly called despotism or tyranny. And in fact, after the French and American revolutions, a common fear among enlightened liberals like Kant or Tocqueville was that democracy would result in a tyranny or despotism of the masses. So the term dictatorship itself originated from a function in Roman law. It described an elected magistrate who would assume special powers for a limited term of 6 months in order to defend the republic during states of emergency when the existing order and constitution were threatened by insurrection or war. But in certain exceptional cases, first Sulla, then Julius Caesar, the dictator extended beyond his mandate, exceeding the term limit, and altering the constitution. In the case of Caesar, this means the end of the republic and the shift to empire. So the term dictatorship has an ambiguous relationship to the categories of tyranny and despotism. A dictator only becomes a tyrant if he fails, in this context, to respect the legal limits of his office. Now, in the period of revolution in Europe from the 17th to the 19th centuries, all of these categories were in flux. The existing orders were being overthrown by revolutions, new constitutions were being brought into being, and so it was a period in which force and violence, rather than legality and legitimacy, determined the course of the political future. And so dictator, as a concept, now potentially signified the agent which would produce new constitutions and guide the revolutionary order in this generalized state of emergency. During the French Revolution, the National Convention was attacked as a dictatorship. During the 1848 Revolution, the bourgeois provisional government was described as a dictatorship. These were the democratic revolutions. Now, after this period of upheaval, Marx carefully chooses this word, dictatorship, for strategic reasons. The whole emphasis of the term is the proposal of the general idea of a class dictatorship. In the case of the dictatorship of the proletariat by a majority of the population whose political goal is to abolish all class distinctions, rather than the dictatorship of a revolutionary minority, as we often think of it now. That idea, the idea of a dictatorship by a revolutionary leadership, by a minority revolutionary elite, was represented by Louis-Auguste Blanqui and his followers, and their premise was that the dictatorship of the revolutionary minority would make it possible to re-educate the public and reshape society. But Marx rejected this model of organization, and his subversion of the word dictatorship intends to propose that a proletarian revolutionary regime would be one based on a far more popular participation than any government that had previously existed. And this is a vision that he saw realized in the directly democratic Paris Commune of 1871. Instead of referring to the Commune, we could refer to the General Strike Committee of the Seattle General Strike in 1919, whose 100th anniversary, I presume, you will be celebrating next year with another general strike. But for now, we can look at what Marx said about the Commune. On April 12, 1871, just 2 weeks after the beginning of the Paris Commune, Marx wrote a letter to his friend Dr. Ludwig Kugelmann. He was a social democrat and gynecologist and friend of Marx. And Marx elaborated on what he had said earlier. He said, if you look at the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that I say that the next attempt of the French Revolution will be no longer as before to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. And this is essential for every real people's revolution on the continent, and this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting. And he reiterated this in his retrospective account of the Commune, the Civil War in France, with the line, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. So, in his account of the Commune, Marx describes what smashing the state means. Obviously, the state is not a physical object, but a social relation, so it's not obvious how you might smash it. But what Marx's account of the Commune shows is that smashing the state is actually a process of the construction of other social forms. Specifically, as he outlined in the case of the Commune, governance by municipal councillors who were workers rather than aristocrats and professional politicians, who were chosen by universal suffrage and subject to immediate recall. And as Marx put it with excellent sarcasm, instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent the people in Parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people. So the repressive functions of the state were no longer separated and standing above society, but were replaced by the arming of the general population. in the very short lifespan of the Paris Commune, 2 months, it could not have possibly demonstrated the full process of smashing the state and constructing a dictatorship of the proletariat. But Marx saw it as a breakthrough because, in his words, it was essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. The commune was therefore to serve as a lever for uprooting the economical foundation upon which rests the existence of classes and therefore of class rule. All right. I think that this is pretty clear and unambiguous. The concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is one which has a clear foundation in the writings of Marx and Engels, and it is a concept which aims towards the abolition of the state. I have no particular attachment to the term dictatorship. Obviously, it is now imbued with different meanings. But I do insist on the necessity of this perspective for those of us who consider ourselves to be Marxists. But there is also a more difficult and ambiguous question, and that is of the relationship between dictatorship and democracy. As I have already noted, there is no inherent opposition between the terms. To give another example, Lincoln established a dictatorship during the Civil War specifically in order to preserve the democratic constitution of the Union. However, the contribution of Lenin in the months immediately preceding the October Revolution and slightly after was to put the category of democracy itself into question. There are 2 levels of critique. The first is the division, which will be elaborated later in his polemic against Karl Kautsky, between bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy. He writes in The State and Revolution, democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is the democracy of capitalist society. And so he cites the exclusion of women from suffrage, the spatial obstacles to freedom of assembly, the availability of spaces, and the capitalist organization of the press as example of the restrictions on democracy that exclude the public from participation, a real exclusion even if formally these rights are granted. And in his account of the Paris Commune, he argues that, this is Lenin's account, that the dictatorship of the proletariat represented the turn from bourgeois to proletarian democracy, from the democracy of the oppressors to that of the oppressed classes. That is, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the first realization of a genuine democracy, a democracy of the majority. But there is here a plot twist. He then says that this new, genuine democracy will begin to wither away, owing to the simple fact that freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will be accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state. So despite the claim that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the first truly mass democracy, Lenin nevertheless claims that democracy itself will wither away, and thus rejects democracy as an emancipatory political concept. He says, democracy is a form of the state. It represents, on the one hand, the organized, systematic use of force against persons, but on the other hand, it signifies the formal recognition of equality of citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure of and to administer the state. And he insists that the abolition of the state means also the abolition of democracy. 3 minutes on the abolition of democracy. Okay. Okay. Let's say, I'll try to very quickly allude to this. The whole history of political thought, from the ancient period to modernity, is the question of the best form of state, how best to govern. And there are various alternatives. Democracy is one of many. There is aristocracy, oligarchy, monarchy, etc. And many political thinkers find these other forms to be superior to democracy as means of governing. And democracy is a form which derives its legitimation from the claim that the state can represent the will of the people. But when this takes the form of representative democracy, of parliamentary democracy, it is not the direct expression of the will of the people, because there is no unitary will of the people. We know people disagree and have different positions. And so there must be some way of discerning a will of the people that can be put into policy. And even if this system is based on decisions by majority, the minority who has not voted for the particular decision that for whatever policy wins will have to accept that its own will is to go against its opinion. This is a basic contradiction of popular sovereignty. But I will just say, the thought of Marx and Engels and Lenin is to break with this whole tradition of determining politics on the basis of the best way of governing, the best form of state. It is a break with the idea that there is a political future in which the state will take its ideal form. It is the idea of a stateless society. Now, the way that we determine in our popular discourse what is the best form of state requires a certain set of norms. I'm going to say there are three norms. One is an economic norm, that is the management of the wealth of nations. Second, the category of the nation itself, the protection of borders and the security of citizens. And then finally, the legitimacy of its rule, which for monarchy is divinely ordained, for aristocracy, which is a common conception in the Enlightenment, the greater education and wisdom of the elites, and then finally for democracy, representation of the popular will. Should I stop?
No.
Okay. So in this sense, democracy is not a general and universal political concept, but rather only one specific norm among others of a specific conception of politics, which today is based on the global capitalist market, national borders, and the bureaucratic apparatuses of parliamentary representation. So Alain Badiou calls this norm capital parliamentarism to distinguish it from the abstract ideal of democracy, which is empty because it doesn't correspond to the actual processes of governance. And in order to present this kind of critique of democracy, I'll end with this. I'll just allude to an idea that in the early 20th century extended across the political spectrum, from the extreme right to the mainstream liberals. And for an account of this, I will quote the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt. He said, "The situation of parliamentarism is critical today because the development of mass democracy has made argumentative public discussion an empty formality. Many norms of contemporary parliamentary law, above all provisions concerning the independence of representatives and the openness of sessions, function as a result like a superfluous decoration, useless and even embarrassing, as though someone had painted the radiator of a modern central heating system with red flames in order to give the appearance of a blazing fire. The parties do not face each other today discussing opinions, but as social or economic power groups, calculating their mutual interests and opportunities for power. And they actually agree compromises and coalitions on this basis. The masses are won over through a propaganda apparatus, whose maximum effect relies on an appeal to immediate interests and passions." And he says, for further elaboration of this propaganda apparatus, that the reader should refer to, he says, the very shrewd, although too psychological, American book, Public Opinion. This book, Public Opinion, was written by Walter Lippmann, and it was made famous. Walter Lippmann, a well-known liberal journalist, coined the term the Cold War and so on. He has been made famous in a certain way by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman because he contributed the term the manufacture of consent. The function of journalism is to manufacture the consent of the masses for decisions which have already been taken by the power apparatuses of the parties of parliamentary democracy. And I'm just going to stop there. All right.
come at this from a slightly different way, but I hope it meshes with what Asad has been saying. I'm going to read two quotes to begin with. And I should say the first quote contains a sentence that makes my head spin, and you'll guess what the sentence is when I read it. When Lenin faced the problem of actually destroying the existing state, he had to realize that if he followed through his original ideas, he would then have to face the still continuing external war and counter-revolution without the support and with the enmity of those sectors of the inherited military and administration that were now potentially loyal to the new regime. With its own vast military, the United States could afford to be more like Lenin than Lenin himself. To the extent that it saw the inherited state and its inherited military and administration and military structures as part and parcel of an old regime, the idea of destroying these structures could be entertained, supposedly, without the fear of a scenario in which social order collapses because of missing state inputs and the emergence of armed political actors who cannot be controlled without the presence of much stronger state coercive forces. Author of that paragraph is a political scientist named Andrew Arato. The book is called Constitution Making Under Occupation, The Politics of Imposed Revolution in Iraq. And of course the sentence that really spins my head every time I read it is that the US could afford to be more like Lenin than Lenin himself. This must be the only time that the entire United States has been compared to being in a situation of Lenin. Generally, the US and Lenin are held to be in two separate political universes. One of which is the good universe called democracy, the other is called dictatorship or totalitarian dictatorship. And the suggestion that there is a situation that might be similar or analogous, and that the US might act in similar or analogous ways, is, I find, a revolutionary suggestion. I move on to the next one. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Northern expectations were that a properly executed Reconstruction plan would result in the South's restoration and rapid entry back into the Union. Instead, white Southerners resented the North, despised the idea of equality of their former slaves, and spawned on an insurgency that resulted in their domination over blacks in the South. By studying Northern efforts during Reconstruction and the roots of Southern insurgency, leaders in the US today can understand the pitfalls of Phase 4 planning in Iraq and the roots of insurgency. This is from the Naval War College. It's called The Failure of American Civil War Reconstruction, Lessons for Post-Conflict Iraq. When I read it the first time, I did think of making a bumper sticker that read, "How can we reconstruct Iraq until we finish Reconstruction in the United States?" But that's too long to be on a bumper sticker. But what's interesting in the Iraq situation is they're reaching out for analogies everywhere. Not only do they go to Russia in the revolution, they go to Germany during the occupation, they go to Japan after World War II, they go to US Reconstruction. And Chomsky said once that everything is sufficiently like everything else from a certain high level, but when you get lower, there are a lot of differences. But I do think that there is a reason they're going for this, and it has to do with the notion of transition. In each case, you're moving from one legal order to another, a new legal order, and that's the transitional moment. That's a foundational moment. So it's linked with an old traditional political theory that you can find in Machiavelli, with the foundation of a new state or a new order. And it's a transition is a word when we hear of the transition in post-Franco Spain, or the other way in 1973 from Allende to Pinochet. And what I think we find almost universally in these moments, these transitional moments, is that the default the default action, the default mode of dealing with them, is what we might call dictatorship. And by dictatorship, I don't mean a particular Aristotelian type of political regime, as Asad said. The tendency of American Cold War thought is to speak of democracy and dictatorship as if they were two types of regime, one of which was good and one of which is bad. So I'm going to try to examine the point, the notion of dictatorship from a naive point of view, not strictly etymological or even genealogical, but just to play with the words to see where they get. So one can approach the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat either through a contextual reading, which is what Asad did, where you just follow it, which is good. But what I want to do, the reason I'm doing this particular gesture of naive attempts to sound out the meanings of the word, is I'm trying to dissolve what I think of as the double world universe of what worldview Marxism was for very many years. There was bourgeois science and there was Marxist science. There's bourgeois method of thinking, and there's a dialectical method that you apply. One of the problems with having such a notion is it appears to the outside like it's a closed doctrine of some kind, which leads to all of these particular comparisons to it being a religion or a doctrine or something, which it is not. And I think simply in the way that I use it, is the difference between clear thought and unthought. I mean, that's basically, it makes much Marx's model of capital is clear thought, and neoclassical economics is unthought. Yeah, well, it's a lot more things. But anyway, so I'm going with this concept of dictatorship of the proletariat to try to see if we can reconstruct it as a subset of a more general concept called transitional dictatorship. And my argument about transitional dictatorship is that the mode of it is to exercise dictation on other people. It's not a dialogue, okay? So when we think of the word dictatorship, we don't want to use Latin words like dictare, to say, or so forth, but we think of dictating something, which is then transcribed. It's not discussed or replied to. There's a diktat is a famous phrase that's often applied to the Versailles Treaty because it's dictated and not negotiated. The victor has the vanquished has no choice but to accept it. So if you look at all these transitions, some things, almost everything is dictated. And it's not necessarily, as Asad said, simply the exercise of violence on a high level. It's dictated as to persons forbidden from political activity, newspapers forbidden to publish. You can't be in politics, have Nazi newspapers publishing, or even though a lot of Nazis did sneak in the back way, but theoretically. But also things that were decided, like how many people should be executed or imprisoned. We think of it as the Nuremberg trials, but in fact, really, before those happened, there were large discussions among the Allied leaders as to what should happen to Germany and how much vengeance essentially should be taken. Should it be a Carthaginian peace where it was Germany was reduced back to an agricultural country? That was Morgenthau's idea. Churchill wanted to kill some ridiculous number, like 5,000 people, because Churchill was a bloodthirsty imperialist, unlike Gary Oldman in the movies. We know his views on Palestinians, on Iraq, so that's why Churchill was the hero of the what, right. So all these things are decided, and they're dictated. The theorist of dictatorship, as Asad referred to, is Carl Schmitt, the one we're most familiar to, particularly because he's been revived among left political theorists in the 20th century. And most people know Schmitt's notion of dictatorship through the first sentence of a book called Political Theology, sovereign is he who decides the exception, which Giorgio Agamben has elaborated in a book called States and Exceptions, so people have encountered it first there. But I'm going to go back to an earlier book of Schmitt, the one he wrote right before that, called Just Dictatorship, where he had actually a different notion of dictatorship that's more historically grounded. And as Asad said, it's a Roman institution. And there are 5 or 6 conditions for the dictatorship. It's appointed in the time of emergency, if Hannibal invades Italy or something like that. But it's appointed by the Senate. It's a commission. It's commissariat. It's for a limited period of time, but it can be removed. And the dictator holds absolute power of life and death over all citizens. They can kill anyone he wants. There are no laws that restrain him. But the one thing he cannot do is to change the legal order, to alter any laws. So this is the norm of dictatorship according to Smith. It's a commissarial dictatorship. What he claims is the perversion of the commissarial dictatorship is the dictatorship of the proletariat, because that's essentially violates the norm of not being able to change laws. It's all about changing and putting in a new order. He says, how limited can a dictatorship be if it's legitimated by a hypothetical future as opposed to a past? But I would argue that this is under-theorized, and that in fact what you're dealing with is a polarity and a legitimate opposition between what I would call a commissarial dictatorship and a transitional dictatorship whose purpose is to conduct a transition and to create a new legal order from one that is, and get rid of another one. And all of these things are operative in Germany, in Japan, in Iraq, and certainly in Russia. And what we find is the same situation. Sometimes an armed insurgency that's one has to respond to and so forth, and the same question of whether we do we take the people who are running the Tsarist bank and fire them, or do we keep them as the head of the bank? Well, they kept them as the head of the bank because nobody else knew how to do banking. They had specialisti or whatever, I forget the Russian word for it, in factories. Do you get rid of the Ba'ath army, or do you keep some Bolshevik, some Tsarist officers, but keep an eye on them by having political commissars in each unit? These questions all come up in every transition. So I want to go back to the transition that affects us the most, I think. The decisions that were made and not made there, and that's the Civil War. Because I think it poses a really interesting question about whether we want to dictate or not. The Civil War was at the end of the war, legally, the country existed in a peculiar position. There was the claim, I think, that Lincoln held, that the Constitution had never been suspended. It was still in force. That there was a continuous United States, a continuous tradition of law. And yet the goals that were embraced by the victors implied the foundation of a new order that was built on equality and democracy. The refoundation of the US on this new basis. But instead, the attempt was made to introduce these revolutionary changes, some of them, but maintain the fiction that the original Constitution had never ceased to be enforced. In other words, that this was not a change, a legal order that kept going. So the problem came about specifically with one issue. The southern states, when they had to vote who would represent them, elected Confederate generals, the most reactionary of the reactionary. And the black voting rights, as an amendment to the Constitution, after being passed in the Congress, had to go to the states one by one. So the question was, do you allow them to vote on it? The Confederates or the Southerners, you give them a say. And the answer was obviously no. And what happened was, in 8 states, interim military government was appointed, and they rubber-stamped the amendment and went through. So essentially the Constitution was broken there. It was dictated rather than discussed according to legal procedure. But that act of dictation was never acknowledged. So I want to leave with a last question. When we look at the failure of Reconstruction in the United States, the spectacular failure, not just in 1877, but through the whole Jim Crow era and the rise of the inhuman carceral state, America's gulag, and where it has left people of color and poor people in this country now. My question is, if one looks back at this moment, does one want more dictatorship or less dictatorship than was exercised? And I think I know the answer that black people would make. So that's my presentation. Asad will be up here to answer questions with me on any of the topics that we discussed.
Maybe we just pause for a moment and let everybody sort of reconfigure so we don't just get the usual suspects and so on.
Right, and let's if there are any women who want to ask questions, let's start with women first. You know, it doesn't even have to be a question, but just to kind of extend the discussion anyway, or, you know, a comment or opinions, or there is nothing out of bounds, even a half-formed thought.
Or denunciation.
Denunciation.
Ideally of both of us.
Yes, yes.
No one else is going to ask. Jump in.
Okay, jump in.
So, those were great talks and really, really interesting. And I thought at the end, one of the things that really could connect them in an interesting way is that, you know, Du Bois takes up in Black Reconstruction the dictatorship of the proletariat and the general strike to talk about the general strike, to talk about the desertion of the plantations, and the dictatorship of the proletariat to talk about the Black Reconstruction legislatures in the South that mandate redistribution and the creation of the public school and so on and so forth. And it's an interesting kind of moment in kind of the history of Marxism, you might say. And it's an interesting appropriation of the concept that kind of, in certain ways, sort of links the two talks. You know, I've argued in some of my previous work that democracy is a kind of indispensable term for black struggle. Even though I take the critique, you know, I think the critique is really, really well done, and the critique that sort of suggests that the Marxist critique of the state and the Marxist critique of democracy are actually part of the same argument, really. But I just wondered if you would have any reflections on that sort of turn in the genealogy. And I guess the last thing I would say is, you know, it is worth remembering that mass democracy is like not very old in the world, right? So, if it's the woman question in the United States, obviously it's not until after 1921, and if you take race seriously, it's not until after 1965 that you even get mass democracy in the United States. So it's a very short span of time that we even have something like, you know, universal suffrage, for example, right? So that also then potentially maybe transforms some of the ways in which we might think about the concept in terms of how it's been used in political thought.
Should we batch a few? I mean, if there are other...
I think that's a really interesting question. Now, why don't you start? No,
Well, that's a good idea. Maybe other people have questions, then you guys.
Yeah.
All right. Let's take a few questions.
on.
I mean, I think that democracy thing is worth talking about for a little. And if people want to amplify that particular direction, it would be fascinating too.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. Do you feel state capitalism, as practiced in China, is is a more advanced form of state than that of neoliberalism or parliamentary democracy? And do you think that one or the other ripens the conditions of the working class movement or has a different effect on it?
Anyone else want to jump in, build on?
Anyone want to go into that? Steve?
Yeah, I think one thing about the dictatorship of the proletariat is that it has to be of the proletariat, so it's only when workers are actually in control that the transition to communism can take place. And that's part of the reason I think that the political rights of the bourgeoisie were restricted in Russia, because otherwise they could undermine the transition towards communism. And I also question your idea that Lenin kind of dismissed democracy when he said that democracy itself would be withering away. Because it seems to me he was talking about political democracy, but there were still going to have to be economic decisions made. And although he didn't specify that in State and Revolution, I would have assumed that he would understand in the future that economic decisions would have to be democratically made down the line, even after the withering away of the state.
Do you want to take Mike's and Steve's?
I would also just make one other comment.
Yeah.
Well, just, I mean, kind of following that, something kind of loosely connected. I mean, the dictatorship and the proletariat was understood as the passage between, in some sense, this capitalist state and then society, which would be de-alienated and full of like free time, qualitative improvements of standard of living and that sort of thing. So I just wonder, just kind of speaking to this like transitory phase with this horizon that's in view. I mean, you were kind of doing that a little bit, but something else maybe to kind of come up a little bit.
Anyone else, or?
Do you mean what Marx envisioned when he said like dictatorship and proletariat, the horizons of that?
Well, beyond that, in some
Yeah.
sense, beyond that was, what,
Yeah.
different.
I
Totally,
mean,
like what this I was getting at or something. But yeah, go ahead, Jimmy. Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about starting to get to this question, right, of like the language used, right? Like how now it's so hard to see dictatorship as anything remotely positive. And I don't feel like I completely understand how Marx saw this term dictatorship. I hear what you're saying about the tyrant as actually, usurping in Rome the kings, and that was where the word comes from. But do we know anything about where this word comes from? I mean, not to reduce it to language, but like, what was he thinking of when he used this term dictatorship? What did it mean at that time in his historical period?
Great. That kind of, Janine, your question kind of ties together a lot of what's been asked. I think what dictatorship, first of all, Marx often talks about the rule of the proletariat. And he seems to use it interchangeably with the dictatorship of the proletariat after Wedemeyer introduces the term. And so he's kind of in dialogue with other people in the movement, and these different words are coming in and being used, and he picks that one up, and it's not really elaborated. It's not, he doesn't actually say it in the Civil War in France about the commune, things like that. He talks about smashing the state. He talks about breaking the state machine in his comments on the commune, but not about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So what is the meaning of dictatorship used in this sense? I think you have to go more broadly to call it class dictatorship. And that is the insight of the term dictatorship of the proletariat, that often certain people like Kautsky and other people who sort of shied away from a revolutionary agenda, they tried to suppress this aspect. That not only does the post-revolutionary society involve the rule of the majority, the dictatorship of the majority, the existing society is a bourgeois dictatorship. The existing parliamentary democracy, even though it has the structure of a democratic society with formal equality, even though, as Nikhil pointed out, that does not at all mean a real equality. The formal granting of rights to all citizens coexists with the exclusion of people from that category of citizen. So what does it mean in this sense? It means that the rule of the bourgeoisie is above the law. Okay? And that there can be, in a great deal of moments, especially in the states of emergency that are provoked by insurrection, an exercise of bourgeois rule which goes beyond what is permitted by the law. And that happens consistently throughout the 20th century, and in fact is the reason why we now associate the term dictatorship with fascism. Because the bourgeois dictatorship is above the law, and in certain states of emergency, in response to the threat of the extreme threat of proletarian revolution, which had already been realized in the East, in Western Europe, the bourgeoisie came to accept an extreme form of dictatorship as a possible means of resolution of that problem. On the point about economic decision-making, there is a chapter in The State and Revolution, which is about the economic basis of the withering away of the state. And the point that Lenin makes, he refers to the German postal system and says, all of these things which we never anticipated were possible before have now been and that before were monopolized by experts and administrators, are now simply technical operations that could be done by anybody. Okay? And that's only become more and more the case with the kind of technology we have. I mean, if we were able to send an iPhone back to the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, we may have had an entirely different kind of history, because what we have in our pocket has the calculating power of 1 million planners, people, trying to plan an economy. I mean, we've gone to a different level. And so the economic basis of the withering away of the state that Lenin describes is that what happens in the economy will be the mere administration of things through technical processes. It will not require the rule of administrators, and thus it will not require any kind of form of separate authority. So even then, democracy as a form of state, I think, is not a necessity in Lenin's logic.
Well,
So
it's good.
implicit in this term of the dictatorship of the proletariat is sort of this understanding of bourgeois rule
Dictatorship,
as dictatorship. And so it's a little bit ironic. He uses irony a lot.
Yes.
Marx, yeah.
Especially Lenin, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I want to riff off a little about democracy and what Nikhil asked and so forth. So mass democracy really came to Chile in 1958. It was the first time that the elections were open for most of the population. There were always restrictions beforehand, even though Chile had been called a democracy for 40 years because there was there were elections and there were alternation of parties. There were some of those usual standards, which I will discuss a little later. And it lasted for 12 years. And the reason it lasted for 12 years is the following thing. Hispanic elites, landowners, latifundios, and so forth, there's a kind of a philosophy called accidentalism, which stems from the Middle Ages, that democracy is not a substance, it's a sort of accident, it's not essential, as long as it serves the higher goal of an aristocratic society in Chile and preserves the landed estates and so forth, it can be tolerated. But if it steps over those particular bounds, it immediately gets thrown out, right? And what happened in 1967 was when people voted democratically to have land reform, not sponsored by the United States, I should say, through the Christian Democratic government and the Alliance for Progress, at that point the right totally succeeded from the country. My point in making this, and eventually there was a coup 6 years later, my point in making this clear is that sometimes when I hear the left talk about democracy with a certain sneer or contempt, one should, I think, put oneself in the position of a member of the right, looking at it as something that he or she finds incendiary, that literally will provoke them to overthrow. What is it in that particular thing where they find that they are threatened in their being, in their power? Even though we think it doesn't threaten their power, they do. The ultimate point about democracy, or whatever kind, I mean real democracy as opposed to formal democracy. I like that distinction better than bourgeois versus whatever. Formal democracy means there are motions you go through, but you can't really exercise those powers even though they're guaranteed in some sort of legal code. Real democracy means that there's broad power from below that's spread out through all of society. It's never happened. By the way, we've lived in a liberal society. That's the important thing to remember. So you can re-describe the whole conflict, social conflict, from the French Revolution to the present, which you can talk about and should talk about as bourgeois and proletarians. But you can also describe it as a contest between people who wanted more democracy and people who wanted less democracy. Marx was one of the people who wanted more democracies. What's the guy's name? Nimster has a book that essentially says, look, politically, if you look at Marx in the 19th century, he's part of every movement that is for opening up democracy and making it real instead of formal. Who are the opponents of democracy in the 19th century? I mean, not only the conservatives, liberals are opponents of democracy. Liberalism sees itself as something that needs to tame democracy. Liberalism is about it's about drawing a sector called private life and individual rights, which the state or power can't enter. At least that's how it expresses itself politically. Democracy is it's nothing about that power should be spread broadly at all sectors of society. So liberalism always Barack Obama is a classic example of a liberal technocrat. Someone who essentially wants the good liberals want to do something for the people or to get agencies to do something, but the notion of creating a situation where people would make decisions is something that liberal society does not offer and won't. And the American Constitution, any kind of constitution, in fact, the rule of law, as opposed to having a legal code, is a way to try to take politics out of the hands of people and put it into some automatic machine which people can't touch. The constitutional code, the laws, the Supreme Court. That's what liberalism is about, the judicialization of politics. So in a certain way, the important thing to understand about democracy is it has never existed except in the original period of Greece, an exclusionary democracy, but one where the people who were involved in that democracy had the power to vote on everything, on the economy, on war, and so forth. There was no decision that was handed over to constitutions, to laws, and so forth. People were selected by lot, so the idea would be that all people of whatever variety could get in at some time, as opposed to elections where, as Aristotle said, only the best and well-known people live. So, and there was accountability wasn't a phrase in Asad. It described giving a verbal account, a logos. Everybody who had served in the ecclesia, the Athenian assembly, after their service had to appear before 1,500 citizens and be questioned about how they spent money, about how they did this, and so forth. And if their account didn't square, they could be sent to their account. In other words, exiled or killed. So that particular notion, people dismiss that notion of democracy, but that's the concept. That's what it is. And we can say it's not relevant to modern life, and that's fine. I'm willing to go that way. But something about turning decision-making about things that affect us into our own hands is attached to that word democracy, and it's something that elites have never, and certainly capital, has never wanted to grant. Now, how we use that within a particular
leftist structure or so forth? I don't really know. I've had this argument with Robert for a long time, or not with Robert, but I got Keith Tilford at our autonomous university. We would argue about which word was more tainted, democracy or communism. I mean, who the fuck knows? It's like, obviously, just because George Bush called what he's exporting democracy doesn't make it democracy. And yet a lot of people on the left that sort of said, look at that, this is what democracy is. So I don't know the answer to that. And I would like to turn that over to the audience to throw in ideas. Stephen.
So I think I'm not satisfied with what I'm hearing here. The concept, Asad, you said that Lenin said that the state would be reduced to certain technical functions that could be executed by various technicians, and it didn't really involve a lot of conversation and discussion and et cetera, is what I gathered, which was saying. Proudhon looked at the state. Ultimately, it could be dwindled down to like a department that keeps the what is a foot, what is a yard, various measurements would be determined, pounds, and that's all we need about the state. But I don't think that that's really clear. I think Steve has actually an interesting concern here. What are we going to do when we have a revolution, you have a dictatorship of the, let's say you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, whatever it is, you still have to decide, are we going to still have planes? We have an ecological disaster. Are we going to have cars? I mean, who's going to make these decisions, and how are they going to be made? Yep. And I don't have a clear idea from the idea that what you're saying is. I don't understand how that is going to be handled from your perspective.
Are there others we can batch in? Anybody else?
I guess just kind of responding to what Stephen said, it seems to me like the entry point into that is reconceptualizing things as a totality, that there's not some world that we live in that like communism is imposed from the outside as we think about it, that like the only way to unfold it is from within the structures itself. And so driving at, like, how do we untangle that? And I don't think that there's any, it seems to me like that's such a monumental task, and it's not something that I think happens instantly, that even if there is this thing called revolution that happens and suddenly there's a different group in power, the only way that we know, the only conceptualization we have at all of how to socially reproduce ourselves from today to tomorrow is in a capitalist framework, and that's all that there is. And so there's this way of kind of turning that around, and I guess that's, when I hear dictatorship of the proletariat, that's kind of how I understand it, is it's not leaving it to continue to unfold itself according to the kind of abstract framework that capitalism is today, that we unfold our social lives into, that it involves this kind of monumental transformation of deciding that we have to unfold our world towards something different. And so I don't know, like all these technocratic answers, I think that those that are questions, I don't think the answers for that could really, we can't even speculate about it.
So I think that's good. And the phrase communism is the real movement of things is the one that, without setting down a strict blueprint, sort of says it comes out from within capitalism now, but it's a real movement towards something else that we follow. It's not imposed from outside the totality. But we have to find that real movement.
So, just for clarity regarding the uses of the word democracy, I have three senses in which I would use the word democracy. The first would be one of the forms of state, which, as I described, is its role in political thought up through modernity. The second is the conception that Philip explained, which is the rule by the demos of itself, the rule of people of themselves, in which case it is not, as Marx and Engels define, the state. That is not the state, which is a separate coercive power. Okay, so that sense of democracy means discussion and direct decision making, which is not a state. The third sense of democracy could be the use within mass movements of forms of organization which are not hierarchical or elite-led, but based on participation and decision-making, and collective decision-making. And this is a desirable goal for all movements. My point is to say, first of all, that Marx, Engels, and Lenin criticize the first conception of democracy, which is democracy as a form of state. Okay? And they recognize that in the transitional society, it will not be possible to immediately eliminate that separate power. Okay? Because the transition is a process in which entirely new forms of life are created. And that the stateless society does correspond to the second conception of democracy, in which there is an identity between the rulers and the ruled. People govern themselves. Okay? The reason I insist on the critique of democracy is because there is a tradition, and this is already present in Karl Kautsky's critiques of the Russian Revolution, and in the entire social democratic tradition across the 20th century, is that the conception of socialism as democratic socialism too often is based on using the existing structures of parliamentary democracy as the means for realizing socialism and taking them to be the meaning of a society in which people rule themselves. Thus, the apparatuses of parliament, the idea of free and equal individuals who have rights and as the bearers of rights, egoistic individuals, all of those are taken to be things that will persist forever. And that conception of social democracy, I think, is one that has to be rejected. And we have to replace it with a different way of conceiving of politics, which leads to that second sense of democracy that Philip described, which is not a state.
And we could detort Vidya and say, essentially, it's mistaking capital parliamentarianism for democracy. I think that's a good point to end. Thank you very much, Northwest Film Forum, for hosting us again, Red Day, and thank you all for coming and